Friends and colleagues, Bhayo Behno, welcome to the 19th webinar of the 30 webinar series that INHAF and a number of partners are hosting for the last 4 months. As you know, we started in mid-June, and by the time we complete 30 webinars, it will be late November, hopefully. During this webinars, we had over 120 urban experts, specialists, professionals, government officers, citizens, students, pavement dwellers, some residents, all kind of people from across the country, in fact, from across the world, have come and shared platforms. They came and they talked about, especially the slum dwellers and the payment dwellers, talked about problems. And then, of course, they talked about issues, solutions, approaches to solutions, innovations. They posed challenges and talked about a large number of issues to think about. We had as many as 25 partners in organizing this 19 events till date. And in this program, we have covered good number of subjects and themes. We had number of seminars, webinars on migrant labor, on slums and affordable housing, on urban formal sector, urban economy, urban planning. We had on government projects. We had webinars on investment. We had uh, we had long discussions on resource mobilization and all that. Now, urbanization and city development, as you all know, is a very vast, very complex, and multifaceted phenomenon, and therefore all this was necessary and have been received with great deal of enthusiasm. Let me kind of say that all this effort that we've done up till now, we have tried to share with wider society the nature and complexity of urban challenge. I was told by one of my colleagues that by now we had something like 25,000 people that we've reached through different platforms. Second thing that we've done is we have brought home the point that not only the government or the municipal body or the water boards that must think and rethink about our cities, that people who worry about, who think about cities, has to be much wider and much bigger. The third point we try to make is this, that there's a plenty of knowledge, information, skills, motivation in the wider society that can meaningfully contribute ideas, innovations in search of new approaches and solutions. And the last thing is this, that this has to be not a one-shot effort, but a continuing, ongoing effort to finding workable, viable, affordable, and sustainable solutions to the urban challenge that we face. And we are very delighted that so many have joined in the process and have contributed so much meaningfully. Today's webinar, as you have seen in the advertisement and the reach out that we have managed, is the second installment of four-part sub-series we've been running on sustainable mobility. Today's webinar is anchored by Professor Rutul Joshi, who is at CEPT University, and he is, of course, a known urban expert. And his today's subject is, where is my bus? As a matter of fact, when I saw this, it appeared a very strange question because we always thought that the bus was here. We will soon know why he's asking that kind of question. So, with that sort of a brief and short introduction, I request Professor Rutul Joshi to take over and introduce the panel, introduce the subject, and carry on conversation. Thank you very much, and we look forward to a very, very delightful, very enlightening webinar this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirtibhai, and thank you for organizing this wonderful set of webinars that you have. And we are really look forward to this Mobility Fortnight, this webinar being the second in series. And some of us have been debating about various topics that we need to cover, and the buses happens to be a very, very important subject that we need to cover. And here we are going to talk about not only the large cities, but also small and medium cities, and when city is ready to start having a bus system, some understanding about that, but also what are the inherent problems with the bus-based public transport system in our cities. I was just looking at some numbers and I was surprised to find that we have 30,000 urban buses in India. Now, imagine that tells us something. 30,000 buses is nothing. We have close to, 200 million private vehicles in the country, 20 crore vehicles, out of which we have 30,000 urban buses, right? And then if you sort of divide it by the population of the major Indian cities which have functioning bus service, you will realize that first of all, the number of buses itself is very, very low. Okay, many experts recommend that for every 1 lakh population, you should have 50 buses. We do not even have 5. Now, when it comes to buses, the problem is not only with the numbers, but also the way in which the bus systems are operated in the city. Cities grow, expand. It's not necessary that the bus operations always keep pace with the expansion of the city. So sometimes the connectivity gets lost. The routes don't get updated for years and years to come. And they keep on running the buses in the same way for a long period of time. And then we get into this very negative cycle where the buses services are declining, with that the ridership decline, with that the revenue declines, and then we are in the negative cycle of the organizational problem, political problem, and finally the citizens loses out on the service. For many citizens who are low income group, middle class population in our cities, buses are a very, very important part of their daily lives. Wherever there is an active bus transport, we have seen that people have been able to use that and reach out to different areas in the city. Buses expand their livelihood opportunities at an affordable rate. And this is what we find in number of research that we have done in our cities. So having said all this and having given this background, the question that I'm asking myself is, do buses have a status problem in our cities? And let me explain what I mean by status problem, because I remember very clearly once municipal commissioner of one very big city in India telling us that, my bus service company is making about 300 crore losses. I want to give it away to the state government. We are talking about reverse centralization. Ideally, had it been a metro system, you would call this viability gap funding, this 300 crore, and then allow it to operate. But when it comes to buses, it is noted as losses. Okay, so then my question also to the panelists is, do we have a status problem when it comes to buses in our cities? So having given this sort of setting, I don't want to take much time because we have a very, very eminent panel today, and I cannot wait to hear from them. As I go along to each and every panelist, I'm going to introduce them. And it will not be a typical bio, it will be a slightly personalized introduction. So let me start with Professor Dinesh Mohan, who's been an honorary professor at IIT Delhi for many, many years, a fierce advocate of sustainable transport, and many of us have learned actually transportation planning and road safety from him. So Professor Mohan, let me start with you. how do you see, what is the nature of problem when it comes to bus-based public transport in Indian cities, and then how do we sort of go towards solving it?
Thank you very much. And I must be very grateful to Kirti for inviting geriatrics to this discussion. Uh, and because we are so old, we have, I guess sometimes we have some ideas, not always, because the new ideas come from young people. First of all, I would like to just say it's not a technical problem. It is not a technology problem. And all of us, including the young people, have been saying the same thing for 40 years. So when I was young, I said the same. So we have not really moved on how buses should work and why they don't work in India. And the problem is we only talk about technology and supply. And buying more buses are not going to solve the problem, because in all cities, the bus load factor has decreased in the last 10 years. So even in Delhi, the number of people carried per bus has decreased in the last 10 years. So we have to understand why, number one, is happening in India. And secondly, we must also understand that in the former centralized economic systems or communist countries, as they have liberalized, before they liberalized, they had all the systems we are talking about. They had widespread public transport systems. They had wide pavements and footpaths. They had bicycle tracks, and they had enough bus systems, trams, and metros. But in all the former socialist systems, the car use has increased without exception. So it's not a question of supply. It's not a question of just footpaths. And I would like to add that if footpaths, provision of footpath cycle was an issue, then a lot of people should be walking Chandigarh and using public transport and in Lutyens, Delhi. But the fact is that they are not. Chandigarh actually has destroyed what a city should look like in India, because Chandigarh is a dead city only for cars. And that's a problem, because everyone who moves around in cars and motorcycles, as all of us know for years, that people who move at a faster speed are not interested in architecture. They can't see it. It's only people who walk and bicycle are interested in the surroundings. That's why all of us find Lutyens, Delhi streets, roads beautiful, because car owners find driving through avenues with a lot of trees very nice. But they can't see anything. They can't see the buildings. They can't see nothing. And so the car owner's view of what is a beautiful road is anti-public transport and anti-walking and anti-bicycling. Because if you walk, you must be able to enjoy the architecture around you. You must be able to loiter, stop, talk to friends. I think for such discussions, it's very important that we should hear from people like Professor Fadke at this, that there should be freedom of women to loiter, because it's when people loiter on the road, because the road is not just meant for going from A to B. A road is also a socialization place. And all our city designs do not consider that. They do not want people to loiter. There's no place to enjoy the scenery. If you walk in Lutyens, Delhi, and most of our new colonies and new developments, all you see are boundary walls and barbed wires and sentries and guns. It's not very conducive to doing anything which is decent. So I can predict that all our new parts of the city are designed so that public transport is not used. All our roads have medians with fences. So that is inviting crime, because if someone is being bothered on one side of the road, even a policeman cannot cross the road to save them. They have to go 1 kilometer on the motorcycle or police car and make a U-turn and come back by the time everyone's gone, except the victim. So our urban planners have done a disastrous job of our cities, and they have decided that until I die, public transport will not work. And I think this is the most serious issue. It's not a bus issue, it's a city issue. And unless we understand this, we can't go very far. And we must also remember that it's not an IT and ticketing systems and bus scheduling, it's all rubbish. Because when none of this was there, and Kirti would remember, lived in Bombay for 10 years from 60 to 67. Lived in Powai when there was only a train to get to the city. And all of us used public transport, was run efficiently all the time without modern technology. The ticketing was tick, 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 tick. He used to give us a ticket and no one went without the ticket in the Bombay bus. Same thing in Delhi. Without technology, all of us use public transport. It is not a status issue. Let's be very clear. It's a status issue for people who want to make excuses. And for rich people, see, everything is status, including using a laptop, including having a nice headphone. Why do people buy better pens or nice shirt? Everything in the world is status. So as rich people look down upon poorer people when they want to become better, saying it's status. So I think we have to be very political about this. And so I would say that also the funding issue. As long as we want the central government to fund bus systems, it will never, ever happen. Because then the local people have no role. The local IS person has no role. So for example, in the new, what was it called? In UPA time when the buses were given?
JNURM.
JNURT or whatever. What happened? Nothing happened. So as long as we keep asking for doles, then the central minister and the secretary and the joint secretary can turn off the dole whenever they feel like it. So it is a politics and democracy issue. If you want buses in your city, you must pay for them yourself locally. And I don't mean people who travel in buses. I think people have to be, every major city must have local taxes to pay for local transport. And so that you have to have employment tax, you have to have pollution, whatever you do. So everything must come from the city. Why should the tax, since majority of our taxes come from indirect taxes, why should a villager buying a beauty pay for you to buy your buses in the city? It's very unfair, undemocratic. So asking the central government to fund buses is rubbish. Absolutely undemocratic. And therefore, until we establish taxation systems, until we get rid of IAS and IPS, because there have to be local people in the city who have an interest in the city, who don't get transferred, who make choices. You must have local companies, public sector companies, and they can give contracts and some kind of partnership with for efficiency. But that company must raise its funds from the local political system, number one. Now, and secondly, what is public transport? We forget, according to me, in every city of India, more people use public transport than any European city today. If you include three-wheelers, tempos, shared autos, e-rickshaws, etc., the total use of public transport in India is much higher in every city than European cities. So we don't look at our own systems. Indians have a huge inferiority complex, the upper caste Indians. Because we don't know, we don't want to even understand what's good about us. There are a lot of things bad, but unless you understand what's good, you can't improve what's bad. So I seriously think that even today, except for rich colonies, the Indian city is working better than any European city because everything you need every day in your life is available within 15 minutes walk. Or people come to your home to sell you vegetables and so on, and to sharpen your knives, etc., etc. So the point is that we already have these systems. And the idea that everyone can live within a short distance from work is a very, I would say, misogynist idea. Because we're thinking of the man who wants to live close to work. But a husband and wife, or two partners living in the same house, both have jobs. How can both people's jobs be close to work? It's not possible. This idea of housing, like in IITs or the government officers close to their work is a British colonial idea when only men worked. And so important, serious people got homes close to their work by giving them cheap housing. So in the modern world, you have to say that and we've already done it. We've got cities within cities. Delhi is 20 cities. When I go to see people, I've not been to 80% of the Delhi. I never need to, either to make friends or to buy anything, etc. So the point is that we must understand how, in spite of our master plans, by breaking laws and illegality, our cities have developed by compulsion because of poor people into reasonable, dirty cities. The question is that from this understanding how the organic development of the city has taken place, how do we make this organic development more fair, cleaner, etc., and workable, and see the strengths. For example, we say we want to pedestrianize. Come on, you go to any part of most of our cities, most of it is pedestrianized except some motorcycles causing trouble. You know, the cars are crawling along through the crowds at 10 kilometers an hour in those areas. So the whole issue is things have happened. How do we improve them? Number one.
Right. So can I?
Yeah, I want to just come back on the fair. So
Right.
I'll just take a few things and then I'll stop. That is fund. You can't run buses at all. There is enough demand for buses, but people can't use them. Because about 20% of the population in our cities, who are very poor, should not be using any motorized transport because they should not be spending any money on transport. That means the poor people should be allowed to live all over the city like chickenpox. So that's already happened because illegality in what we call slums. In Delhi, the slums and Jhuggi Jhopri areas are like chickenpox all over the city because they settle close to, most of them settle. Then we move them out and send them outside the city. And then we say we have to give them public transport. So basically the fares have to be less than what the motorcycle costs in petrol. It means that today's prices, the best fare should not be more than 1 rupee per kilometer, number one. Number two, since cars have become very comfortable and cheap, nowhere in history were air-conditioned cars as cheap as the cheapest Maruti compared to our incomes ever, never in Europe. So Indians can buy a car, air-conditioned car, at much lower incomes than Europeans in the 50s. So in European cities, no one uses public transport by choice except enthusiasts. Most people in the world use public transport because they have to, for two reasons. Either they don't have the money to own a car or there's no parking where they're going. There is no public transport used by choice for most people, especially in countries which have motorcycles. You cannot compete with the motorcycle for young people. No, forget cost. If I have to go 500 meters, what's the most convenient way to go? On a motorcycle or a scooter? It's much better. You can park it in your bedroom and park it in your friend's bedroom. And you go fast and no one can bother, especially women. They're much safer going on a motorcycle than walking on our roads because there are Indian men around. So the point is that let's get back to think about the city and not the bus.
Right.
Every bus user has to walk 4 times a day, round trip, and cross the road twice. So we have to make the road much nicer for that reason. And all buses will have to be air conditioned and low floor at 1 rupee a kilometer, otherwise forget it. And that money has to come by taxing the rich in your city. They will not be given to you. Not the 300 crores will not come from Mr. What's his name? Puri in Delhi. Okay. So this idea that Mr. Puri will fund your nice life will not happen at least until I die. So please don't depend on Mr. Hardeep Puri. So you have to take all the stuff in your own hands. And I would end by saying that the structure of the city makes it impossible for most people to use public transport. If you look at cities where people use public, which you keep talking about, in Manhattan, Tokyo, London, Central London, et cetera, Paris, wherever people use public transport a lot, your blocks, there's a traffic light or a crossing every 200 to 250 meters. Here it is not for a kilometer, you can't cross the road. So secondly, all our roads are now being made very wide. How can you cross the road? You can't cross the road. And lastly, you must have businesses all along the roads. Like the reason why it's used in the old part of Mumbai or Chennai, etc. So say in Pedder Road in Bombay, the ground floor is shops. So because there are shops abutting the sidewalk, safety is assured. This is busy. Everyone is safe. All our new cities are being designed with a boundary wall or setback. As soon as you have a setback, forget it. It becomes unsafe, unfriendly, and so on. And so it's very, very important, since we've already done it and our designs are horrible, the only thing we can do is to say, in all the spaces between the road and the boundary wall, there must be hawkers and kiosks all along. Because unless you have hawkers and kiosks all along, it's not walkable. So let's focus on a people's city. And I don't want car owners to shift. As long as you focus on car owners to shift to the bus, you will never, ever solve the problem. Because even today, the number of people who own cars, families who own cars in Delhi is only 20%. Why are you worrying about them? Right. So I just find this incredible that we worry about a very, very small, minuscule number of people and trying to change their habits. It has never, ever been done in the world. Okay, so we must give the bus to people who can afford it, who don't have cars, who need it, etc. And which includes free travel for all students, free travel for all older people, and so disabled people, etc. So the money can only come from taxation, local taxation of the rich. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, sir. I'm very glad that you started with the larger issue of the city structure, politics, and democracy. That's a perfect start. Let me move on to Shreya. Shreya is the South Asia Director of ITDP. Been instrumental in bringing out very many happy changes in cities like Pune and Chennai and Ahmedabad. So Shreya, you work with many city governments, and all that we are talking about the bus-based public transport. What are the kind of resistance that you face, and what are the kind of solution people are willing to take when it comes to the bus-based public transport?
Thanks, Rutul, for posing that question. So I'd say that I'm not as idealist as Professor Mohan. And, we've been talking about governance, and we have had the 74th Amendment for 30 years now, and nothing has happened in terms of decentralizing. And I would say in some senses that I would take a more tactical approach of how we could make cities have better transportation. And that tactical approach does require both the state and the national government involved in it, because cities, we can keep fighting about governance issues forever. And I'm not saying that we should not have governance reform, just that governance reform would take a much longer time to happen. And therefore what we need are more immediate solutions. So now the question is really, are people not traveling in public transport? That's not the case. We know that a large number of people or public transportation trips in India across the country actually happen on informal modes like share auto rickshaws, tempos, minibuses, whatever you name. And our estimate is that something like 75% of all trips in India, public transport trips, are actually happening on these informal modes. So it's not as if there isn't demand for public transportation. It's just a question of whether it is of a high quality or not, and whether it's optimal or not. We work extensively with smaller cities like Ranchi, where we've seen that there are share auto rickshaws everywhere, and they might sound great as an idealist maybe, but it's also a problem on the street because most of these share auto rickshaws are highly polluting. And you need to question, why do you need to transport the same number of people share auto rickshaws that exist on the streets? Because we've counted anywhere between 300 to 400 share auto rickshaws per hour on many of these corridors in the city, which could have easily been serviced by something like 80 buses an hour. And 80 buses an hour is not a bad frequency. It's a great frequency. If you have a bus every 1.5 minutes, not 1.5 minutes, every 40 seconds, that's a great frequency to have on any corridor in any country, right? And therefore the question is, are we willing to do a reform where we bring in the same share auto rickshaw folks, or maybe others as well, into something slightly more formal, slightly more structured, and something that serves the needs of citizens? So it needs to be a balance between what we think is a livelihood of share auto rickshaw drivers and that whole economy. And then what do we need to do in terms of providing better public transportation services to citizens? Now, the second piece that I'd like to say is that of the 30,000 buses that you mentioned, which are very few for a country of this size, the other piece of it is it's not that it's equally distributed across the whole country. They are only in the top 6 or 7 cities of the country, right? It's just Chennai, Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, and then the numbers start dwindling right after that. And then you have Hyderabad, and then Ahmedabad is already gone down, and then Pune, it's gone down. The numbers are already at much lower per capita than what the other cities have. So the question really is, why is that the case? And that is the case primarily because in the cities which have buses, they're all state run. It's because the state government, which has a much higher, a stronger commitment to public transportation, and because state governments have much higher power than what cities do, that's why you actually have better public transportation in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Tamil Nadu actually happens to have 1/3 of all the urban buses in this country. So why is that? It's because the state government has a stake in it and is saying, we want to support public transportation. Same thing with Karnataka. Same thing with, I would say to some extent with Andhra and Telangana, which has had buses in the past. Of course, there might be questions now whether they're supporting them as much or not, but that's the whole question. So therefore, I'd say that the state governments and nudge from the national government, including potentially appropriate forms of support to cities, are necessary to kickstart a bus revolution in this country. It cannot be purely city-led. I do agree, though, that if the support comes from the national level and the state level, they should be used to nudge the cities to also start reforming what they do with parking. Because parking can be a huge source of income, and they could use that money towards getting buses right in the city. So, maybe I should stop there for the moment, and then I can take up, the remaining part in a future round.
Right. Thank you, Shreya. Thank you very much. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, that we have to take a sort of a tactical approach of dealing with a lot of some of these issues. And let me go to Ranjit with that. Ranjit is a program director at Parisar, which is a very well-known NGO in Pune, and fierce advocate again of sustainable transport. Ranjit, given the kind of situation we have in the country, and given the kind of status of buses and that dwindling number, declining ridership, what kind of tactical approach would you say would take to sort of promote bus-based public transport in India? And having said that, I mean, there are also all kind of debate, whether the city should own public transport or state should own. We're already getting into that. Whether or not we should privatize the public transport out of that 30,000 buses number. I think only 5% or 10% are running on PPP basis. So to what extent should we privatize or leave it to the state governments to take care of them? And what are your views on that?
Thanks, Rutul. So what I'll start with is I'll try to connect the answer to your question with some of the earlier points that were made. In general, I think it is ultimately going to be a really good model if the cities run their own bus systems. And actually some of the cities that we mentioned, whether it's Bangalore, Bombay, Delhi, they all have essentially city-based systems. And certainly there is some case to be made for perhaps smaller cities to rely on the state transport services. But that sort of brings me into what I think, without disagreeing with what the others have said, that who runs these services does matter. And there's a legacy behind this, because essentially in all the states, you have these state transport corporations, and they have their own history and their own legacy, but they've been there, and they're the ones who have been providing public transport services. Some cities have off late, I mean, Delhi is a different case because it's like a state city, but ultimately it's a state-run service. Karnataka BMTC only happened recently, of course, but in cities in Maharashtra, particularly where Parisar has been working in this campaign called Lakho Pachas, which we've been running over the last few months, very few cities have their own city-based systems. The state government, by and large, doesn't like to run intercity services, intra-city services, because it's a different model. You have to plan it differently. The revenue models are different. And largely speaking, the commitment of the state in the past has been to provide intercity connectivity. So often, for instance, the Maharashtra State Service motto is, wherever there's a village, there'll be an ST bus, which really talks about making sure that people have connectivity, which is a completely different kind of problem to solve than trying to provide intracity services. And so I think that's where, and I'm going to just add this new element to the discussion, that I think we've completely missed out on the legislative part of, do cities need to provide city bus services or not? And I think the answer currently is, and we've talked about the 74th and all of that, that they don't have to. Really, it's an optional service. Whereas when you talk about water, sewerage, and other kinds of things, including roads, the cities feel that it is my primary responsibility to provide these facilities to citizens. Public transport, I don't have to. Museums, I don't have to. So they don't. And so largely what happens is that I don't think we should ignore the fact that governments run based on the mandates that are given to them. And state transport services have been given a mandate to provide a bus in every village, and they're trying to accomplish that with all the problems, but at least there's a mandate there, and they're trying to do that. Whereas cities simply do not have the mandate to provide city bus services. And we have cities like Solapur, a mid-tier city, but it's a million plus city, 10 lakh population, not a single bus. So the Solapur Municipal Corporation has never thought about, I need to provide city bus services. So once there is a mandate that you have to provide it, then you get into the debate of what's the best thing for the city to do. Do you want to own and operate those buses like BST has been doing? Do you want to have hybrid models like Pune has been doing, where actually people don't know this, but about a third of the buses are actually run by private contractors? And so essentially, I do want to mention that one of the big pieces that's missing in public transport is the complete lack of a legislative framework that assigns responsibility, assigns the accountability to an entity that says that you have to do this, neither at the state level and nor at the city level. And I do agree that if we're going to go in this direction, we would be well advised to take some of the pointers given earlier, that we should focus on cities taking the responsibility for providing it, but perhaps with the financial and perhaps other capacity to be given by the states. So ultimately land, for instance, for depots might be something where the states come in and they say that you have to allocate this in your urban plans. And I do think that the central government does need to play a role in promoting these services and giving them the financial support for this. And it may simply be, as we've discussed in the past, Rutul, the idea of viability gap funding, because there is going to be a gap between what you can raise in revenue from users and perhaps even city taxes, and what it's ultimately going to cost. And I think that gap isn't as high as we think it is. It's not insurmountable. I think that gap is small enough that if the central government or the state governments make commitments that if you run these buses, we'll provide you with that offset, then I think we may have a decent model going. And this is question that we had asked through the local MP to the Rajya Sabha, and I just got it a couple of days ago, and I do want to share it with this forum for the first time, because we've been talking about this a lot, Rutul. Question was the total budget spent by the ministry, which is MoHUA, for the provision of metro rail and for the provision of urban buses, including depots and terminals in the last 5 years. And it shouldn't surprise us that the answer is 74,400 crores for metro systems, and wait for it, 350 crores for urban buses. So I think it is clear that, as Dinesh says, if cities had to create their own metro services, they would never be able to create a single kilometer of a metro service. Perhaps some rare exceptions, maybe Mumbai would be able to. Most cities wouldn't be able to do it, but it's only possible because the central government has put serious money behind it. And of course, we've talked about the fact that city bus services are seen as services and therefore judged on profit and loss. And that's a statement that comes out every year. So every year somebody's asking this question, ye loss bana rahi hai, how long do we keep managing these losses? And what I just noticed is that with metro systems, you do the DPR once, and as long as you can manipulate that IRR or whatever they talk about, the internal rate of return or some number, and God knows how they come up with it, but you have to cross some 8% or some number, some magic number. And if you could cross it, then it's done. And then nobody asks the question. Nobody ever asks ever again through the life of the metro system about losses and profits. And I think the same thing happens with flyovers, with coastal roads. It's all about that one time. If I can just show that this investment is justified, and once that project is built, nobody asks any questions about how much ridership it was supposed to have, how much congestion it was supposed to ease, etc. And so I think bus systems are just in this separate bucket altogether, nobody's baby, and therefore constantly judged on the basis of this profit and loss. So I think there's some legislative gap that we should also try and target and plug that. And which is why in the campaign that we've been running, we've actually asked the state government that you make provision of public transport services a mandatory service, just like water and sewerage. And then you'll find that the wheels start turning. Then the money comes through the public budgets, people are assigned. If I say how I have to provide, then the question of how much then comes up. So is it 50 buses per lakh population? Is it a service every 5 minutes? Because you have to set those service benchmarks. And then you hopefully get these wheels turning. And again, this is a more, maybe not quite tactical, but at least a strategic approach to it, but without getting into the larger issues of urban governance reform, which I agree are important, but I also agree with Shreya that that's a long haul.
Just one sentence.
Right.
As long as important people from the center have to fund public transport, it has to be metro. Because all the embassies, Korea, Japan, America, US, Germany, etc., have 5 conferences a year saying we should have metro systems, and all the important and rich people make money in the center. How do you expect the center to spend money on buses when they don't make money on it? Come on.
Right.
It's transport 101.
Okay. Okay. So I think the discussion is already getting very, very interesting. I have to sort of remind all the viewers that please leave your question in the question and answer box for any speaker, and please direct it to a speaker, or just sort of keep it as an open question if you like. Now let me go to Ravi Gadepalli, who is a sort of young, brilliant scholar, researcher, consultant working with World Bank and UITP, who has recently worked in Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, knows Bangalore also pretty well, where some of these successful bus systems are running. Ravi, what are your views on how do we improve our bus-based public transport?
Yes, thanks Rutul. Thanks for the great introduction, and also to the organizers to actually put me on the same panel as so many brilliant speakers, and particularly Dinesh Mohan sir. I mean, the way I think about transport is basically taught by him and Professor Geetam Tiwari. So if I make any mistakes, sir, so please excuse me if I. So you're on mute, but maybe you're scolding me, but you're on mute actually. So so the thing is, there are many issues to solve clearly, and my previous speakers have already made a lot of points. So I'd like to focus on only 2-3 points specifically. So the thing is, largely the bus agenda and many things have to happen. But there are many places where people have already realized that buses are important, but still they are unable to crack the problem. So if we find a way to solve the problem there, maybe the others, as they get converted to the idea of improving bus services, they may actually follow the example. So principally, there are only two things I'd like to focus on right now. So one is the organization part of it, which Ranjit made, and the other about the financing part of it. So firstly, on the financing, we know that there's no money that's being given for buses, but that's actually a small fraction. So I'll just share my screen to show you something. So this is actually how UITP, where I also work as a consultant, defines the whole public transport problem to be solved. So each of the issues that we have been talking about fit under this nice framework. It's called the House of Public Transport in the UITP circle. So the base of it is the political support for public transport, which we don't have currently. So it's not just an image issue. It's just that the thing is, it's a OPEX problem. Public transport is, particularly the bus services are an OPEX problem, whereas the metro is a CAPEX, the capital expenditure problem. So like Ranjit said, you just need to make a DPR once and you get the money, because majority of the money is required to pour all the concrete to build the metro, which is the majority. After that, it's OPEX, which is minuscule. Whereas for buses, you actually need more. Every year you need 80% of the cost is on staff and the fuel, which is a recurring expense. And so unless you have a strong political support for buses, and that's what Shreya also mentioned, that in Bangalore and Tamil Nadu, so where the actually government realizes that it is important to provide buses because many people depend on them and things like that. In fact, in Bangalore, we think a bus is only a poor people's thing and there's an image issue. In Bangalore, the IT sector Employees Association actually approaches the government to improve the bus services. And that's how the bus priority line actually happened in Bangalore, because they'd like to use their real estate to actually provide offices and earn money out of it rather than just providing parking for all the employees. So it's not just a poor people's issue. Even after a point of time, everybody realizes that buses are essential for effective functioning of the cities in general. So I would suggest working with those cities and then addressing the issues there. Building political support where it is non-existent is of course the first thing. So on the legislation, legislation and organization are two separate things. We sometimes confuse ourselves in India. So in terms of legislation, India already has a strong legislation which can support the state transport undertakings or the bus agencies. So the Motor Vehicles Act already has certain sections where the local authority can nationalize routes, which means that other competing operators cannot operate. I mean, it can go up till that level. Whether that is desirable or not is a separate issue. But organization of how we actually provide this service is where I think we are not doing very well. So what does this mean? So for example, in Europe, the public transport service obligation means that there is a transport authority which defines a service level, which is met by different operators, including the rail, bus, and whatever else. So in our case, the buses are planned by the STU where it exists, and where it's non-existent, the SPV or whatever is running the buses. And then the paratransit permits are given by the transport department separately. And of course, metro is a separate issue altogether. So of all the talk that, of course, the money is going away to metro, which is a problem, but on road conditions, the mode share of metro is not more than 5% anywhere. So in terms of actual people being traveled on road through shared mobility or collective mobility modes, so the real issue is between buses and the paratransit or the shared mobility provided by informal services. So that's where we need to organize it better and ensure that these modes are not competing with each other. So particularly you raise the issue about small and medium-sized cities. So there, like Shreya was mentioning, in Ranchi or in Vizag or Hubli Dharwad, wherever you take the city, so there are shared auto rickshaw operators at running at a really small margin of income. So there is a social issue that so many people are getting employed, and you don't want to take away those. There are those issues which can be addressed separately, but just from a transport planning or organizing point of view. So you want to provide a dignified way of moving in a city, and right now that's not the case with the informal operators we have. So while the government is not doing anything and they are filling a gap, right now we should be thankful for them. But as we talk about improving the systems, we need to find a way to get them into the system and then organize all of it together. So whether you should disallow all the paratransit and just have a government bus, shiny bus that comes once in half an hour, which is not good enough for the city. So that's not what I'm trying to propose. What I'm proposing is that instead of letting them run on their own and then competing with each other and killing each other with competition, we need to find a better way of organizing them. So it need not be the nationalized way of how a Bangalore or Chennai operates, but there are other solutions available. And particularly on the financing issue, the OPEX thing is a key problem to address. So we have worked on a World Bank project where we looked at the bus service provision in different states. So Andhra and Maharashtra were cases, but we also looked at many other states. So the key thing is, like I said, majority is the OPEX funding, and per passenger kilometer, it is just 20 paisa, 30 paisa per passenger kilometer, really. So it's not a significant viability gap funding. But the real problem is the way we finance transport. So every year it is a discretionary spending. And so sometimes when the state likes to give away money, they may give some 150 crores or 200 crores to the bus agency. Sometimes they don't get anything. So in that case, what the operator does is whenever there is money available, they just buy the fleet. And then you see when somehow they will keep making losses, and at some point, hopefully the government will make them good. So it goes in spits and bursts, not a consistent implementation of bus service quality. So instead of that, we need to find a way of putting that under the revenue head. So it's a technical change really. So to have a revenue head in the budget for public transport and keep putting money into that, I think, so that is the way to go about it. So these are some of my initial remarks. Maybe I'll come back later.
Right, sure. Thank you, Ravi. And if you can stop sharing the screen. Thank you. Okay, so let me go to Avinash, and I think the title of this webinar comes from the kind of interesting campaign that they are running as part of CE Parisar Summit. We are all part of it to say that, well, you know, you might have a disagreement about who should run the buses, how you should run the buses, etc. But the question is, where is my bus? Why am I not getting the bus service in my city, and how do I get it? Right? And I think that's a very simple and straightforward question that we want to pose to the policymaker, that where is my bus? So I would like that Avinash, who's part of the CE Pune, who's been running very interesting campaign, earlier participatory budgeting, now the bus-based public transport. So Avinash, if you could tell us a little more about the campaign and what has been your experience so far.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rutul. And it's really a very interesting journey when it came to really thinking about Lakho Pachas, because as Sumnet, we do stand for walking, cycling, supporting IPT as well as buses. But as members, we met together in our annual meet in Indore. And we could definitely see that, okay, buses ko leke, the buses are not in the talk of town typically. And the argument we typically would have that more or less whenever civil society and academics are together, mostly we are bitching about somebody who is not in the room, number one. Number two, even though you are bitching about them, doesn't matter because it doesn't change the politics of what is happening and the whole political economy. And first learning definitely in the reflection we had about the transportation is not a technical matter. It's a political issue. And how do we really bring then that into discussion with politicians, and how do we really then target the member of parliaments, or let's say urban development committee or a relevant ministry, to really take a stand on it. And broadly, one idea was that on one hand you have national urban transport policy, which is not legally binding. On the other hand, you have motor vehicle act amendment, which talking about national transportation policy. And then we are also worried about ki whenever a newer policy going to come or an act going to come, we don't want that particular act to really play with what has been already achieved in year 2006, with whatever lacunas there in the policy. So first demand was also to look at, can we really integrate these two and make the national transportation policy and urban transportation policy as a chapter into the national transportation policy, so that we are able to really have some legal grounding to really fight this battle. Because technically in constitution, the urban is state subject, whereas mechanized transport is on concurrent list. And that's where we would typically get into this trouble, that who's really making rules about mechanized transport, which includes buses. And that's why buses has to also pay almost 1 lakh rupees tax every year. Now, even revising that kind of a taxation, and that figure was somewhere in our mind of 1 lakh rupees being paid by buses every year, whether you run it or you lock it and keep it in Solapur instead of running it to the 10 lakh people, that still remain kind of a broad question. The demand was who should really trigger this, and that's why the state government came in, where they should really define the rules of the game for the cities of different sizes. Important thing is, can we have national bus system fund? We are not saying that just give buses of JNM, just to say that when we did a study on impact of JNM on cities, very interesting response I got from one of the respondents saying that ये टाटा का नया ब्रांड बहुत अच्छा है. And I said, टाटा का नया ब्रांड कौन सा है? तो he said, वो जेनम नाम का बस उन्होंने जो ब्रांड नाम दिया है वो काफी अच्छा है, क्योंकि it people couldn't understand between JNM not as being a branding of Tata, but it is like a program under which it was funded. But लगता है लोगों को कि जैसे जैगुआर है वैसे जेनम होगा, और थोड़ा वैसे भी था ब्रांडिंग के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से. But coming back to when we thought through ki what is that we want to do, we thought of at least doing three things. One is that we wanted to create forums for participation. The commuter who is traveling, where is his voice in this whole discussion? And that was really the core target, that how do we bring day-to-day commuter into discussion, so that they will speak not a language of any expert or technician, technical expert. They will talk about मेरे को time से बस चाहिए, मेरे को ये दिक्कत होता है, कंडक्टर ये नहीं करता है, ड्राइवर वो नहीं करता है, but वो भी उतना ही valid है. But there are no forums even within city, and even though I raise a grievance as a commuter, there is no authority where I can actually take up or held the municipal city or a state city really accountable for the grievance I'm raising for not getting better service or getting any trouble for that matter. So one aspect was, and that time we didn't had Corona. So Corona came up for the campaign as an out of syllabus kind of a question, because originally we planned it with CIRT in the first discussion with all stakeholder meeting, that how do we really also partner a government institution in this whole process. And the idea was that we will go to cities. We will do almost like a 4-day campaign in the city. You first do like an really a media catching kind of an event, where you can put in maybe carpets of around 60 cars, and then put maybe a bus park there, and really do an Indianized version of a very typical photographs which we had been seeing in our presentation of transport, how many people are traveling into car, how many in two-wheelers or cycles, and then how many people are traveling in a bus. A very effective photograph. Can we do it in cities, and then really have a stakeholder consultation with helping some of those media coverages, and then giving our suggestions to MPs. And now this plan somehow got washed away because of Corona, but we still continue to make this convert this campaign into an online campaign. And there we are getting the online petition. We have about more than 45,000 people signing up for the petition. The other thing which continues is really city dialogue, and some of my learnings from all this campaign also comes from the city dialogues. One interesting panelist, Anant Miriganti from Hyderabad Urban Lab, really brought to our notice that people are smart enough. They will learn how to live without buses. And hence, they will leave how to live without buses. It is most important to keep people and keep buses in the sight of people. Because people will travel, whether you like it or not, if you give them bus or not. The second thing which also came up very interestingly is about where are the forums for pulling people and where are the forums for pushing people. Maybe city like Pune, there is both possibilities are there because of this presence of civil society and some kind of greater understanding of the transportation issues and their complexities. But that may not be the case in most of the cities. The other interesting part is definitely this, that commuter forums do not have federations at neither city level, nor state level, not national level. And one of the ideas of campaign is also that how do we really help facilitate a commuter raise their voices for better buses and better services, which is really age appropriate, at the same time low floor buses, and most critically I would rather say that access plan ke point of view se. In this, I think Dr. Sandeep Gandhi's contribution was immense because he was part of our city dialogues where he will do like a projection of each city. All we are providing, let's say, the city growth rate as well as the present bus fees site, and he will come up with a projection till 2050. And that was very interesting to also try and bring city administration on board, try and bring at least some state administration on board. We had been partly successful and in bringing at least government people on board, but the target always remained that how do we bring commuter stories so that when we are talking to politicians, they should not say ये तो बहुत लोग बोलते हैं, लोग क्या कहना चाहते हैं. And that was really the idea was to get into a people's campaign. The final thing I would like to really say here is that due to lack of forums, due to lack of good RFPs, like I would like to specially mention here that when we did the bicycle plan of City of Pune, it was mandated to us as a consortium of consultant to do at least 2 rounds of public consultation before we submit our bicycle plan to the general body. Now, even though few sensitized urban consultant putting in consultative process for all 2 to 3 levels in your city or sustainable mobility transportation discourse as an input mechanism from the citizen side, I would say that would really help a lot in shaping the kind of city bus services we would really like to have in the city. They may come up with very rubbish ideas also, but it's democracy, not that elected representatives are coming with bright ideas with what Ranjit just shared with us. Point was, when we did this pitch, the estimation was that if we're having 5,000 cities and if we have only 198 cities having some form of formal or informal bus services running in them, and less than about 8 buses per lakh population, the investment in getting lakh ko 50 is approximately 1 lakh crore for that matter. And if you are spending 75,000 crores anyway in metro, if you just add 25,000 crores in it, we would be actually able to provide all the cities of more than 3 lakh population to having not 50, but whatever form they want. I think there is a lot of misconception we also learned in this process that when we talk of buses, but particularly when we're talking of Dehradun, there are no buses there. But this was the first city dialogue where we were started talking about buses, ki apart from cycling, walking in a city like Dehradun. And perception was कि वो bus turn कहाँ करेगा? And point was कि छोटा बस भी ले सकते हैं, mini bus भी ले सकते हैं. पर these dialogues kind of helped in really shaping that discussion, shaping some of the discussion with media, because I think that is one Achilles ankle where first of all you struggle on the reporting part, where you keep on saying कि ये problematic है, ये loss making है, but if they become infrastructure then it should not be loss making anymore. The final thing is also about we initiated some conversation also with the unions, because how do we, and this is really the nuance kind of an understanding one has to build over a period of time, where the unions working with the STUs as well as maybe the city systems would definitely oppose privatization, because naturally there is a clear give and take in this process. Our view also had been divided about when it comes to privatization, because not that we are not human about it. Question remains is both judgments of whether you get a better service through a private operator or get better services done through even existing systems is a debatable and a deliberation kind of a topic. But with unions, union leaders getting in touch, getting information, getting to know, they started sending their representatives to city dialogues, and I think that also changed the dynamics of the city dialogues a lot, and that also helped in also getting the nuanced understanding of what's happening in a particular city, but feeding into the larger conversation. We did approach, the strategy was to reach out to the urban development committee, which has representative of all political parties, and their parliamentary standing committee on urban development. Our final submission, like a semi submission which we could reach through city dialogues and our other processes, was to really talk to the chairman of the parliamentary standing committee. Good thing I want to really report here is that they had invited members of Sumnet to really give a detailed presentation to all the member of parliaments in a formal meeting of Committee on Urban Development. But one thing I learned out of that process was, on one hand, when we are talking about national policy, the the politics remains in the domain of constituency. So we'll have to also shape our communication far more better, where you'll have to also talk to MPs through their constituency and their location and their city, and also take the dialogue forward with the city administration, which could be chaired by the honorable member of parliaments on one hand, but also to shape the larger perspective that we need to have certain thumb rules, and that thumb rule was really lakh ko pachas, in our understanding, in our view. And the connection can come from any source. It could be climate change, it could be local tax, it could be citizens forming cooperative group and getting it done, or through participatory budgeting. Once the target we are tactically trying to set up well, I think we will find better ways of typically doing it. And apart from the Lakho Pachas national campaign, which C was responsible for and anchoring this activity, Parisar was leading the campaign in Maharashtra, and Institute of Sustainable Development, Rajendra Ravi was leading the campaign along with Nishant and his team in Delhi. And we had a youth summit. We had a very interesting conversation of youths coming from that, how bus reminds you of a caste system, how bus reminds you of gender, how bus reminds you of how you treat your elderly people when you sit down in a bus. And very interesting stories are available all on the social media handles, and commuter stories are available on the Sumnet website. And we are really hopeful that it's just a beginning to bringing bus in the talk of the town, but at the same time, forms of that needs to be shaped in the city in best possible way. That's all.
Right. Okay, thank you, Avinash. That was wonderful. It sort of suddenly brings a people's perspective into the fray. I think there are a lot of questions which I'm going to very quickly curate for all the speakers, but please feel free to respond on other respondents as well. So let's get into the second round, where I will try and collect some questions at least for each of the speaker. So Professor Mohan, back to you. There is one particular question which talks about, that while you take the operation cost to be paid by the commuters, why not use the central or state funding for buying the buses or buying infrastructure, or at least asking state government to give the land for the depot? So don't you think in that sense, it's really the job of all three tiers of the government to do something about the public transport in our cities? Sir, you're muted. Sir, you're muted.
We have to listen to Avinash. Everyone talks of political support. Political support is not individuals. No politician will do anything over the long term unless there's pressure from the users. If I know politics very well, I've known a lot of ministers, very senior politicians all my life. And if I know them, if I was a senior politician today, and all of you came, I say, fantastic, all of you are talking real good stuff, man. I agree with you completely. And after you left, I won't do anything as a good politician. Because there is no pressure on me. Please understand that. This rubbish about politicians, why should they? They'll talk to you. They're same class, same caste. They'll talk to you and say, very nice people. The only way you can have pressure on politicians is for the commuter to say this is what we want as a political issue. There is no pressure from commuters because there is no middle class male pressure. All middle class males have a motorcycle. How can a poor fellow, put pressure on rich people? So we are refusing to understand history. Why did public transport come up in Western countries? Because there was political pressure from the middle class who were forced to use public transport. Please look at current situation. There's not a single country in the world where motorcycles are dominant where public transport works well. Because there is no middle class male pressure on the politician. So if you leave it to politicians in the center as individuals, I as a politician will fund the metro, not the bus. I gain money from the metro. I gain international acclaim for the metro. All the prime ministers, presidents, Mr. Bloomberg, all international NGOs are very happy. Secondly, it's not just the issue of why should the politician listen to you? There are no professionals working on the system. Not a single IIT, MS or PhD in transport has joined a transport company in India, a public transport company. Not a single MS or PhD from a IITs has joined a municipality. So all, either they work for international aid agencies. Please read a book called Winners Take All. Philanthropy is going to destroy us because there is no, the international, Mr. Bloomberg comes here, he can meet the Prime Minister, President in 2 minutes, and he destroys what we've done for 20 years. So unless there is local expertise of high quality in the people who are running the companies and not from outside. Professionals can't be outside because they don't have a stake. If when they say something, do this, if it doesn't work, nothing happens. We have to be accountable to the public. So until there are good jobs in the companies, whether private or public, run public transport companies, unless there are jobs for them which my students take. Not a single of our students works for a public transport company, not one out of all the IITs. So it's a very serious issue. You can't leave the system and they say, oh, we're very nice people, we worry about climate change, and please give us public transport. Why? I have no single reason except decency to give you public transport. I have no political pressure. So unless the people who use buses do dharnas, stop traffic, none of us have the courage to go out and call a dharna on the road and stop traffic. Come on, what politics is this? Politics is forcing politicians. No bureaucrat, no engineer, no policy maker makes policy of the long term without pressure. And so unless we understand politics, I'm not interested in who, because if you want the center to fund, they will only fund the metro. I can give it in writing. The question of funding buses doesn't arise. So if you want to say you have to convince politicians, let's do politics then. And you can't do politics because please go and have a look in the Delhi metro. There's not a single middle class executive in the metro. In buses, it's students and clerical level people. There's no one in a tie in the bus. There's no one with what we call middle level executives or government officers in the bus. So how can you have political pressure? So I don't care what regulation you make.
But Professor Mohan, there is one interesting example.
So I'll just come. How do you put public pressure? It's a long-term issue by taxation forcing, because why does public schooling work in all European countries and US? Because people pay taxes for the public school and they know how much money of their income is going to the school system and they have to use it then. There's an interest. So if I am paying a huge amount of tax for my car, employment tax, etc., then I say, why should I spend extra money on a motorcycle? Number one. Number two, if I have local control, then I protest that this is not working. I, as a motorcycle owner, have no interest whether the bus works or not. How can poor people force the system to change? Except through violence and burning buses. They can't do it by talking. And we can't do it because, I stop with this, all of you, if I was a transport minister, I'll agree 100% with you, but won't change anything.
Right. There is an interesting example of politics around public transport in Delhi itself, sir. Just before the polls, the chief minister announced that they will run they will have free tickets for women in the buses and public transport. So there are this kind of examples where politics is happening around public transport. Right?
But what has that done? The number of people using that bus system. I'm on the board of the company which runs buses in Delhi, DIMS.
Right.
The number of people, women using buses has not increased that much except very poor women, maids. What are we talking about without data? And I know how DIMS is one of the better companies running buses in the country. I'm on its board and I know what the problems are. So it was a damn good thing, but it just happened because the individual's idea. Individual politicians' ideas are never permanent because there's no political pressure. It can be removed tomorrow, nothing will happen. Suppose all the women start getting charged tomorrow for their tickets, nothing will happen. Government won't fall. So, I've been in politics for a long time for different reasons. So I know what makes decision maker, even a secretary government of India. Why should I listen to you? Except as a nice person. As a nice person, I make some laws today in the National Urban Transport Policy, and next secretary comes, he has a different idea. So the things, firstly, we must say that all bus companies have to be, the structures have to be changed, and there have to be employment opportunities so that Ravi would be working for DTC and not for these international companies and being a consultant. International organizations are good for exchanging knowledge, but they have no role in developing expertise.
Right.
So not for DTC, but I'm actually working for BMTC. But so maybe I'm the one student working.
But do you have a permanent
not
job?
a full-time employee. Yeah, that's right.
So the point is there have to be hundreds. I'm not interested in one.
Right.
So as long as there are no jobs for my students in municipalities and in bus companies, forget it. For example, say the RATP or the London bus company, New York bus company, there are psychologists working for them. There are sociologists working for them. There are statisticians working for them to understand what's happening. Is there one psychologist working for any company? So let's take a broader look. And I'm really very serious about this because I'm going to die one of these years. And until we start looking at talking about things Avinash was talking about, how do you convince people? How do you put pressure? How do they listen to you? Technical people won't do it. Because among us, the technical people, we don't agree with each other. So why should the politician listen to us? If you call 4 professors of transport from IITs, all will tell different things to the secretary and to the minister. There is no agreement among us. So the whole issue is that we have to go back to the commuter because they have the same concerns. We professionals fight with each other and spout, and I'm happy doing it. But we don't make that much of a difference except making policy.
Right. Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So, Shreya, back to you. And I think now you heard everybody. What do you think? I mean, how do we sort of move towards some more solution to the problems?
See, as in it's nice to talk about ground up revolution, but revolutions don't actually make a difference. Honestly, it's small changes that are repeated, which is what eventually leads to big changes. And so I'd be disagreeing with whatever Professor Dinesh Mohan has to say. I was a student at IIT and he was a professor for at least one of my courses. But as in it's all nice and idealistic, but eventually you need to think about what is it that you are going to do, take those steps, small steps if at all, to make a change happen. And I think that those changes are happening. Yes, the quantum might not be the same, but for example, Tamil Nadu is right now looking at procuring 14,000 new buses or in a phased manner. And Ravi is also involved in that process in some senses, right? So it's a question of, yes, it's a question of building political will. And like Ravi said, it requires that base of political will. And to some extent, I do agree that you do need to look at how do you build that political will through public engagement. But to suggest that the only way to do this is some kind of a ground up revolution of commuters, I think we'd never have that happen. So let's understand that there have to be people who help this process to take root. It was not as if even the Indian freedom movement, for that matter, it was not as if it was some kind of a ground up movement. There were individuals, many of them from elite backgrounds, who eventually engaged with a larger public to create support for independence, if you will. But you do need to, think about how change would happen. So let's not just dismiss the idea that people have to only work within the government and there is no place in the government and therefore the whole thing is hopeless. Then we might not even be talking about it.
Right. So, but Shreya, I think also the other question that I have for you is that I think somebody in the chat has also commented that how about that model where, central state government supporting buying the buses, local government running.
I think there needs to be, I think a very important point that Ravi had raised earlier is that the bus issue is an OPEX issue. And unless we are sure about consistent support that comes as OPEX towards buses, I don't think we would really succeed in the bus sector. And that's what we really need to crack. How is it that we can have a pre-allocation, consistent pre-allocation of operating expenditure for buses as a viability gap, as against separating this whole business of CapEx and OPEX, where, support comes as a one-time scheme for, purchase of X number of buses, and then there's nothing that happens. We've seen time and again that kind of model doesn't really work. And therefore, I would much more strongly bat for an idea of a state level as well as a national, maybe initially by national level, test the idea with a viability gap based on certain performance metrics, and then eventually devolve that towards the states and make it the responsibility of state, potentially through legislative change, if you will, where there is consistent money that goes to city level public transport agencies. And like Ranjit said earlier, yes, you would need city level agencies. I do not expect a single state level agency to be running services, but nonetheless, that city level agency, even a BMTC Ranjit had pointed out earlier as being a city level agency, is still a baby of the state. It's not owned by the city. And therefore, in the intermediate term, I'm fine with state-run city agencies as long as you build their capacity and you have a consistent stream of money coming towards these agencies to be able to deliver on the promise of having consistent public transportation. And as governance changes happen, eventually transfer this whole responsibility towards cities, where cities have their own money and they would also be able to have their own capacity to run services. So I think the essential question is, do we have capable operating agencies, and do we have consistent funding coming towards these capable agencies to provide the service that we need?
Right. Okay, so I think moving on to Ranjit again. Ranjit, there is also a question from somebody from Kerala saying that this Kerala State Transport Undertakings, which does a lot of intra-city and intercity bus operations, they are also running in losses, and because there is a huge establishment cost. It's not a new thing. We hear this many times in many states and many cities. Also, they are asking for some subsidy on diesel so that at least the bus company can run, make some operational profits, etc. So, what is your sort of answer to that particular question, and generally also the view on something that we are discussing?
So one of the things that happened as part of our Lakho Pachas campaign in Maharashtra is that we had some dialogues with the with senior bureaucrats. And for instance, we had an interesting conversation with Mr. Pardeshi, who was luckily one of the commissioners of Pune, but also then the commissioner of Mumbai, and also the urban development secretary. And he sort of echoed some of the sentiments that have been expressed here. He did talk, in fact, about the fact that cities will need to raise their finances. I mean, as a state official, he said states are really running close to being broke. A lot of spending at the state level is very politically driven. And so to try and get the state to commit funds to city level bus services is going to be tough. And I'm only sort of reporting on his sentiments, and we have to sort of take that into account because these are people who have been in the government all their life. And so I think he mentioned things like these employment taxes. He talked about development charges. He talked about, I mean, it doesn't matter what the source is, but ultimately did feel that cities will need to take some responsibility in raising funds to subsidize their public transport services. I think the central government, we feel, does need to play a role. I do agree that the further away you go from the city, the tougher it gets. And the questions of why should Mahua, why should Morth put money into city level bus services is going to come up. But I think it may not be as big a quantum of money from the central government's point of view, and that could just be the catalyst for getting these things going. And I think despite the many shortcomings and critiques of JNNURM, it did get some buses onto city roads, and many cities who had never seen a bus. I mean, that's the thing that Avinash is talking about, that we're having these dialogues in cities where people are like, what, we need buses? I mean, it's really where that's where we're having to start with in some cities, which is quite different from the Mumbais and Punes. But in Solapur, people are like, oh, this is revolutionary in some sense, you know?
Ranjit,
and so
I must say that it's not just some buses under JNNURM. It's 2/3 of the operating fleet right now, which came through NNUR.
Right.
That's the quantum that came through. So if
Absolutely.
something big happened, it was because of NNUR.
And I think it was a lost opportunity.
You know why it was done? You know why it was done? Because the auto companies asked for subsidy for cars.
Yeah.
And the government, I know the story.
And
the government did not want to give money for cars, and they subsidized the car companies by giving it for buses.
And I think that's an example of how sometimes you could get something, even though that may not be the intention of the government. It doesn't matter whether they wanted to. I mean, as a public transport advocate, I'm saying if they took that decision to support the auto industry, to get buses, in a sense, like a commuter who was asking, as Avinash said, where's my bus? I think that commuter is saying, I need a bus, I need it to be on time, I need it to be affordable. Who runs it? Whether it was part of a subsidy scheme for the heavy industry or whether it was part of an enlightened thinking on the part of the government, at the end of the day, a commuter is a little bit distance from that, and including the privatization.
It happened because they had to give the subsidy.
Sure. And so one builds sometimes.
At that time, because of the way politics was running, they were making enough money in cars. And therefore, politically, there was a Sonia Gandhi committee pushing politically for social benefit. So at that time, the UPA thought it was not a good idea, because of the committee with Sonia Gandhi, to look pro-rich. And so if they had to give money to the car company, that's what happened. But those things don't happen very often.
True. And so when they do happen, I'm saying that we need to be ready to try and leverage that the best we can. I think there was a lost opportunity in the sense that having gotten those buses in cities, we sort of failed, and by we, I mean a larger collective we, to see how cities can build on that to then move towards more sustainable city bus services. But one of the things that I do want to mention is that luckily, and this is a tactic that is used by all of us working in this sector, that public transport isn't just about commuters wanting buses. And I think that's an important part that, at least as Sumnet, we do want to play on that. We want to try and promote the voices of commuters, as Avinash explained quite well. But there is also all these co-benefits, and so you can talk about air pollution, and that's something that people are concerned about. You can talk about climate change, which a very few people are concerned about, but it is a concern of the government because there's international pressure on that front. You can talk about equity, you can talk about, so I'm just saying there are lots of different ways in which you can make the demand, and governments work in strange ways. And that's, yes, sometimes it's sheer public pressure which will bring about the change, and we've seen that in certain sectors where people will exert that kind of pressure. I think we've realized a long time ago that getting that kind of public pressure for, let's say, walkability is going to be very difficult, because and the hierarchy of things that people will want to demand, perhaps housing, perhaps ration, perhaps other things are going to always be at a higher priority than a better footpath or a cycle track. And so you're going to have to leverage different ways of convincing the government, of pressurizing the government. I think media pressure works, international pressure works, commitment to certain policies that the government itself has come out work. I think at the city level, what we've found has often worked is that the central government did the NUTP, but we've often taken that NUTP to city officials saying, this is not some NGO saying this, the government of India is saying this. So then at least the commissioner opens that up, looks at it. And if you get people who are willing to push the agenda a little bit, then you get small wins along the way. And I think we need to build on those wins and show that, if it's worked, if something has worked in Pune or if something has worked in Bangalore, how can we promote that idea in other cities? So I'm just saying there's lots of different ways to promote these ideas. I think the idea of having a classy, good-looking bus service is something that also needs to be done. And I think you started the conversation with image, and this, of course, there are lots of other things behind the metro juggernaut, but it kind of sells itself. It looks sleek, it's air-conditioned, it's nice, it sort of plays into that image of what a developed city is, which is why you have chief ministers of states like Bihar and Rajasthan, etc., saying, we want to get a metro in our city. And so you really need to think about, can we do the same for a really nice bus system? And that's another way that one could try and push it. And I think electric buses was an idea that, at least for a time, seemed like, could this be the way to promote more buses, make it more capex heavy, bring down the OPEX? And as Dinesh said, an air-conditioned bus which is smooth, runs well, could that be the hook? Because he's right, it's really difficult to get a two-wheeler user to use a bus unless you can really have that bus system play into the idea of, this is something that's desirable, this is something that works, this is something that ups the image of the city. And I think through this dialogue, not only do we want to hear the voices of people, but we also want to try and sell this idea to politicians. And it may not be just sheer numbers, but sometimes just the way you package this idea. And I think we have to be creative and innovative about it, and explain the various benefits of public transport, and then leverage some of these individuals. Like Dinesh is saying, this public pressure will make sure that things will work irrespective of who the individual is. But if you can get some good individuals and use them to move some of the pieces along this chessboard, then I think those are the small wins that we as civil society will have to take.
Right. Thank you, Ranjit. Ravi, back to you. The question is, there's a lot we have been discussed about, how do we get the buses to work, etc. There is also a question often about the operations. The bus operations, the route planning, the routes don't get updated over a period of time, or not as dynamic. If you look at the IPT service itself, it is such a dynamic, it operates in a dynamic market. Our bus systems, when you look at them, they are frozen in time, and invariably you end up going in certain routes which are not profitable, but or it does not carry any passengers also, but because some corporator has put a pressure on it. So there is a different kind of politics which also operate on route planning and operations. So what do you think about that? How in other cities have tried to sort of address some of these issues?
Yeah, so actually that's a very important point. I've written it down as a point I would like to mention in this round. So there are 2 points I'd like to mention right now. So I'll come to the service planning aspect. But before that, I actually have a middle ground solution between Dinesh Mohan sir and Shreya. So instead of taking a revolutionary approach, we can find a way to get the...
Just a minute. I think it's very unfair if I say something called it idealistic. Am I a fool? Revolutionary? I've never done any revolution in my life. I'm a upper middle class car driving ordinary fellow. So one way to dismiss ideas is to say they're idealistic and revolutionary. I think it's very unfair.
So that's also...
Sir, sorry to make that point. So what I meant was actually one way to do it is through a people's movement. Another way of also approaching the problem.
Please understand me. I never said people's movement. Never. I said that commuters have to put pressure. And the
Right.
commuters have to be powerful enough to put pressure. I'm not, listen, if I want to do revolution and people, I would not come here. I'm only here because we are middle-class idiots. And so please understand this. I'm talking of practical things. That unless commuters put pressure, I, as a politician or a bureaucrat, why should I do anything except as a nice person? And the next bureaucrat or next minister may not be a nice person.
Yeah, so I agree with that point of view. So what I'm trying to say is that the other set of people that the politicians listen to are these international funding institutions who say I've committed 1 billion euros or $1 billion or so. So right now, these funding agencies also talk about buses, but they're not actually putting money into buses. So if we find a way of them financing buses, so then there is a strong likelihood that center and state and city level governments will listen to them and do things. So they have a...
To them. Please, sir? I don't want Indian government to listening to foreign companies and foreign Bloombergs.
Right. So because the thing is, right now,
we work get destroyed by these people.
Right. Right. So the thing is, we don't want them. So I realize that the amount of money they'll actually contribute towards the overall problem that needs to be solved is a fraction. But the amount of leverage they have is disproportionate. So they actually make us change our legislations and things like that, which, for example, getting OPEX funding or a consistent finance allocation for transport is a specific technical solution that the state has to take up, and people may not ask for it. People may ask for better buses, improved buses, air conditioned, electric or whatever, bus priority measures or BRTs. They will not ask for a financing head change. So that is one way of approaching. That is the only point I'm trying to say. So right now, for that to happen, as I mentioned earlier, they are currently only focusing on capex, and that's only 3 to 5% of a bus operating cost. So one solution for that is to develop a state level, city level, central level bus transport fund. So like our states have urban infrastructure development finance corporations where they have created a pooled financing mechanism. So for people who are only interested in specific parts of the problem, you let them invest only in that part of the problem. And you find others who will be interested in the problem also. So the state can take up some part of it, the fares will take some part of it, the capex can be taken care of by some other interested area. For example, commercial banks have zero funding to public transport. So all the bus operators who have won contracts under the city level contracts, they are unable to get money from commercial banks. So even if they are willing to pay the interest rate. So there is a way we need to give an institutional platform for these companies to come and participate in solving the bus problem. So solving this is a slightly complicated problem, and we need to think carefully and work with the governments on this. Which brings me to the second point that Dinesh Mohan was mentioning on the lack of technical capability or interest to hire people who specialize in the topic. So that is actually, to me, a bigger problem which will solve many other things. So a lot of discourse in India is from the user's point of view that, oh, I want more buses, I want 50 buses per lakh, I have 5 buses per lakh, so I need more buses. But there are specific problems to solve in reaching our ultimate target, so which are quite technical in nature. For example, the media coverage on transport is, oh, a bus driver did not stop at the right place, or very basic issues, which are important, of course. I'm not discounting them, but there are more nuanced issues also that needs to be discussed either in the media or in the think tank space. There are not enough people working actually. So even I didn't even have a full-time job on public transport anywhere. So that's why I was forced to become a consultant to work on small projects from multiple organizations. So I may not be working in a government organization, but my full life is dependent on that. So I'll do something useful, but so that it is important for me, even if the government is not paying.
Fantastic, so, you're doing that. No, Ravi, it's a very important point you're making. You're forced to do what you're doing. But what I'm saying is that if you work in the same organization or similar organizations for 30 years in permanent jobs, you gain experience on the same thing. You have a history. You understand things. It takes 7-8 years to become an expert in a small thing. So the point is that unless people have permanent jobs, in these organizations like you. I'd be so thrilled if you could do that, someone as talented as you. So, so we have to start pushing for those things also. Because as long as we say that I'm just happy, so you're doing what you're doing because what from your
no, I'd like a full-time job. So that's the point I'm also trying to make. That so for people who want to work in public transport to solve different problems, on a financing problem or a service scheduling problem or multiple policy issues, so there are no places to work itself. So it may be a government job, it may be somewhere else, but so I think the lack of technical understanding of the topic. So just on service scheduling, understanding travel demand patterns and then how do you schedule. So for example, a World Bank or AFD or somebody else may give $100 million loan over a 5-year period. So whereas that is the annual loss made by BMTC. So so just to improving service scheduling, I may actually make some similar amount of savings. So we are always interested in just on the aspect of planning. We are interested in the new investments that are coming, and we are willing to change the entire legislation for it. But the efficiency aspect is something internal. So if you talk to a typical state transport undertaking, they say that, oh, I've been in the business for 30 years, so I know what I'm doing. So who are you to tell me? So you outsider, like the sir was saying, so you outsider, you don't have a stake in it, or I have to live with the thing if you give me a solution. So that is one area of problems. The other area is that on the other side, they think that they are already doing well. So it's a change to the system which has to be forced. It won't come from internal transformation. Suddenly I realize that, oh, I have to change. So there is an external push required also. On this, also on the issue of financing, we always typically, so when governments talk about it, sorry, just on the planning aspect, in the state transport, so we actually have only 2 groups of service providers in buses in India. So one is the state transport undertakings, which have been there for many years, and they don't want to change. I mean, this is how we operate. We have always been operating. So if this is my loss, this is my loss. So we need to find a way to make good those losses, but there's no way to improve on it. The other area is the SPVs who have basically given up that, okay, I don't know, I have 4 people managing, I better manage the contract because my audit and everything is happening on that. Who cares about service planning or accessibility analysis, all of those things. So we have these 2 extremes. On one hand, they completely accept I can't do any better, and the other hand, we say, I don't even know, I don't want to get into that. So there is a need for some external technical cooperation, and that is where I think the institutions help. So for example, in Bangalore, so IISc, IIT Delhi, Bangalore, so I mean, academic institutions will be there, right? So those are the other set of people apart from government jobs who have long-term jobs who are there always. But they are doing their own set of research. So they have their own objectives, obviously, so publish papers or create new research. But so we need to find a venue for effective, some sort of collaboration between the government and academic organizations. So one hand is capacity building, the other is academic engagement. Just one last point on the STUs, getting money for the STUs. So there is this perception that in the government, so even in the cities where the politicians or the secretaries agree that buses need to be funded, there is this perception that, oh, government is so inefficient, why would I want to fund your inefficiency? You're making losses because you're inefficient. So that's the government perspective. And the STU's perspective is, oh, I'm so efficient, I can't improve anymore. So we need to have a midway discussion between these 2 on whether they're actually inefficient, whether privatization will improve efficiency or not. So particularly on the point of privatization, people think that privatization makes things cheaper because they don't pay labor properly at a minimum wage labor rate or whatever, and so they are cheaper. And so if somebody is available to work at a lower wage, why would I lose that opportunity? But the fact is that wherever privatization actually happened, the operator takes away the money. It's not like he's going to be this God who is going to save you. So it's just that instead of paying the driver or the conductor, we are actually paying the operator for his profits and for the financing he raises and things like that. So privatization is required where the STO doesn't have the capacity. So in many cities, like it was discussed earlier, they didn't even have experience of bus operations. So if you want to quickly deploy private capital and expand services, you need privatization. But even privatization needs consistent funding. We should leave the way this thing that privatization will make things cheaper. It may be at the same level or more expensive. But even privatization requires consistent funding. So I think somehow the politicians think that if we privatize things, we don't have to pay for it anymore. So I think that's the key thing that needs to be addressed at all levels. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Some very important point. So back to you, Avinash, and this time, as you can already see that there are a lot of people getting inspired by the campaign, and we should sort of keep at it. Uh, are there any plans of having some localized agenda? Because I think one very important thing that is coming out of this discussion is it's important to sort of go back to the local, all the way run a national campaign and demand for more buses as commuters. But in different places, there might be very different institutional culture, political culture. Also, the way in which you communicate message in different states might be very, very different. So there would be a need of making a localized agenda and specific city-specific demands. Are there any plans to go towards that?
Yes, thanks for this question, and that really also helps me to also respond to some of these points. One is definitely that this needs to be done and cannot be only done in metros because there at least some level of service is there, and there are groups which are maybe working in Mumbai, Pune, Delhi, several other places who would at least make it at least service provisioning better or try and improve it. I generally, and the answer is yes, that this needs to be done. It cannot be done centrally. It cannot be done by one civil society group or a network. So we need more collaborations, and terms of collaborations, both in terms of how we really place it within the political economy of transport. So one takeaway as a political scientist I would like to definitely bring in here is that the political economy of metro and political economy of infrastructure, which is linked with cement and percentage of money both politicians and permanent politicians will get, is quite defined and clear. That's not really the case in case of transportation, in my understanding. Therefore, more work collaboratively with the civil society groups to really crack the code for political economy of city urban transport, and then particularly buses, would be a very critical agenda, both for research as well as advocacy. And when I'm saying, I coined this term in my PhD thesis, I called bureaucrats, IS officials as permanent politicians who don't have to give exam once they clear UPSC. I'm not having any trouble with them, but at the same time, I understand that the policy shift is the role has been completely shifted. The politicians are not looking at policies and getting into executions at right now from decentralization level to policy making level, and the briefs are anyway made by the permanent politicians, and the real politicians are actually approving them or disapproving them, or sometimes don't even have an opinion about it. So dealing with them going to be a big challenge for both civil society and I think also for consultants, because it's sometimes pro poor policies or pro citizen policies cannot really come out of just a bureaucratic mindset. So how do you make them more accountable through a people's Jensen White type of a model on one hand, also trying to push for RTA, the road matlab the uh, role of RTA, which is given in the act. Sometimes it's district collector, maybe it is practical to really look at your divisional commissioner as RTAs, who are authorities in terms of taking up grievances of the forums, and then trying to also register a city commuter forum as cooperative, so that you can establish, and as we are calling in Delhi campaign, reclaim the bus. So there are methods through which we would have to reclaim buses, but in the city dialogues, it has to be just not one dialogue. Like we discussed in Ahmedabad, that there was a lot of discomfort. You can't do it in a hour or a two kind of an agenda where you can figure out all the issues which you have. So it could be done by different models. One is definitely, can we really say that in Ahmedabad it was really the Ahmedabad Ma kind of a dialogue which continues every 2 months, 3 months or so, where we are reflecting and trying to also bring in a non very abusive way but very cooperative governance way of both elected representatives and bureaucrats sitting across the table and not just blaming and passing the parcel, but also asking critical questions from a commuter and a citizens and experts point of view as definitely one agenda. What we have covered so far is definitely cities like Jaipur, Lucknow. We covered Ahmedabad. We have done in let's say in Visakhapatnam. We have done in Chennai. We are done in Hyderabad, but we are yet to complete and the campaign is on. We are definitely we have, apart from these two state campaigns, campaigns to the city dialogue yet to be done in Calcutta, in Shimla, because we were also taking representative kind of cities. We wanted to also do a like complete state level discussion at in Kerala to also look at the model there, because partners and the kind of stakeholder we really want to engage in Kerala as well onto this model, and to make them part of this campaign. What I really see here is that the opportunity here is to really also identify a role for civil society, because first of all, understanding towards buses and public transport is very limited, and that's the reason Sumnet exists, to really build that understanding. That's our mandate, may not be in our project, but that's in our mandate as Sumnet, and collaborative institutions are really up for it. One interesting insight also in this, that the city priority when we really started was really ration and ration distribution, moving labors, people helping, the kind of really support civil society has really shown during this pandemic. So the priority in all our civil society partners as well as extended networks was really, they were really busy into their work. But this also gives a very interesting feedback to us that it is ration which is important, but not the transport. And that's really comment on all of us, whether this this is comment on Professor Dinesh Mohan or his students, or even on us, that people do not feel transport is important, because we have given in last 60-70 years a key message to people that if you want reliable public transport, you'll have to pay for it. The same message we have given in education, that if you want quality education, go to private school. Same message we have given on health, that if you want health, then go to private hospitals. By disinvestment, by even not having a sense of entitlement. So city dialogue should continue. City dialogues will continue. We will have to have typically a right to city kind of an approach. And just to reply to what Shreya was saying, I agree that it's not going to be a revolutionary approach. Approach remains that the national campaign was really to bring this whole buses back to talk of the town, number one, to create an enabling kind of an environment, both from a commuter's point of view and civil society point of view, so that at least we will not get a very blunt answer from elected representatives that who travels in bus. When we are doing cycle plan, one of the corporators came to me and said that we are not traveling by cycles anymore, and why you want to do a cycle plan and a discussion with us. Point is, our key challenge here is that the whole notion of development is gone in a way that challenge is not there how to get there. The real challenge is how not to get there. So challenge is not to how to build a flyover, how to really demolish it, and also not to reconstruct it like Pune is doing is our challenge. And it's going to be a difficult political communication. And the thing is required, what we are trying to do through the dialogue at the city level, or maybe we will evolve it at the state level as well, that which are the common agendas which are agreeable to most of the stakeholders, we go through a campaign mode to address them. The points which are not yet agreeable, whether it is privatization, whether it is efficiency, could remain in the deliberation domain, and we need to use effective tools and techniques to really agree on not consensus, but agree on what is to be done in that. And finally, what is our like one common thing or few very useful, effective asks which we really want to give to our politicians, so that we get a better answer from them, a reasonable, accountable answer from them, would still remain agenda for a campaign to move on. And this is just the beginning, I feel, and then we'll do better. And with collaborations, nothing is impossible in my view. So yeah, with that I'll end. Thanks.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Avinash. And I think our time is almost up, and many participants are exiting, so we should take a clue from it and conclude. So unless anybody has any pressing last comment or a last word, I think I would like to conclude. And I think I just want to say two things. So first of all, thank you all the panelists for very, very spirited discussions. And something which we all watch TV debates and we almost forget that we can do that. So it's very important that we could do that.
This is our own TV.
The other part is when it comes to sustainable transport, what I've always felt is that, that biblical story of people who are building Tower of Babel and talking in different languages. And that's the reason why they could not communicate and, sort of the tower could not be built. I hope that we do not do that and we continue to communicate and debate and sort of talk to each other and continue to disagree with each other. But at the same time, keep pushing the agenda. That's very important. And I think end of the day, no matter which way we approach, where is the bus is an important question to ask. And whether we sort of want certain way or different approach, that's all open-ended. And I think in that spirit that, different states, different cities will play different politics, will take different routes to reach the same destination. I think we should have faith in that. At the same time, it's very important to keep communicating to each other and make sure that our Tower of Babel of sustainable transport gets built in the end. And we are not left asking that question like, in Samuel Beckett's way, waiting for Godot. I hope that we don't end up waiting for the bus as they were waiting for Godot in the end. And we do get buses and efficiently run buses finally in our city. With that hope, I hand it over to Kirtibhai. Thank you very much, all the panelists and all the participants, again, for a very, very spirited discussion. Kirtibhai, over to you.